Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, Ms. Schmidt.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you all again, too.
So when you get settled, you may begin with your opening comment.
All right, thanks. Well, I want to thank you all again for your service on this commission. You guys have done a stellar job over the past 18 months, 2 years, and particularly under these difficult circumstances today with the passing of Chief Justice Katie. I do appreciate your service. Well, this is our third date, right? So in 6 months. So I feel like this relationship is going in the right direction. But seriously, having put in 2 applications for the Court of Appeals and applying for this position all in the span of 6 months, I feel like you all have gotten to know me pretty well. You know who I am and where I've been and what I've done, and I think you know the talents and skills that I bring to the Iowa Supreme Court. So today I want to focus on something a little bit different. I've been reflecting quite a bit on the legacy that Chief Justice Katie left, and for his family, the court, and the state of Iowa. And it's made me think a lot about how the legacy of other folks really builds the foundation for those that follow. And so today I want to talk about the folks that have built the foundation for me to be here today and to endeavor to serve on the Iowa Supreme Court. And I want to talk about what that foundation is. Bessie Adams was my grandma on my mom's side. Wow, I didn't know I'd have that moment. She became a farmer's wife when she was very young, and she and my grandpa raised 6 children. They had running water inside their house, but until I was about 10 years old, there was not an inside bathroom. It was about that time that my grandpa suffered from pretty serious heart disease, and he was no longer able to work. But my grandparents still had a farm. So every morning, my grandma would put on those, if you farm, you know what I'm talking about, those big black rubber work boots. And she would go out and she'd take care of the pigs. And then she'd come back inside and she'd clean up, she'd fix breakfast. She'd put the boots back on and she'd go out because they had grain, and she'd work in the farm again. In between all that, my grandma's house was neat as a pin. She had a vegetable and flower garden, bless her heart, that was as big as my front and backyard put together. And there were always delicious baked goods on her kitchen counter. Whether it was raising children or raising pigs, running a farm, tending a garden, or at one time working part-time as a janitor at the local high school, my grandma was dedicated to her life's work. For her, it was not a burden or a grind, and I know this because toward the end of her life, my grandma told me that she really hoped that they had something for her to do when she got to heaven because she wanted to be busy. But that was her legacy to me. It was a dedication to the work before her, no matter what that was. My other grandma was Virginia Reel, and if you know anything about dancing, that's a dance, but it was her name. And she was also a farmer's wife, and she also raised 6 children with my grandpa Reel. And they happened to live about 5 or 6 miles down the gravel road from my grandma and grandpa Adams. My grandma was a tiny woman, but she was full of love and warmth and kindness. I loved both of my grandmas equally, but my grandma Reel was the fun grandma. So when we would visit her, she'd pull out a big mattress into the living room, and we'd stay up late at night watching movies and eating popcorn. But no matter how late we stayed up, she'd always be up before everyone else at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, reading her Bible, and taking notes. Now, the point isn't that she was reading her Bible. The point is that she was spending time in disciplined reflection and study. She wasn't just memorizing. She was reading, she was analyzing, she was studying, and as a child, that made a big impression on me. And that's the legacy that she left to me: disciplined reflection and study. Well, I'm happy to tell you that the third woman who's passed on her legacy to me is still alive and strong, my mom, Elizabeth Reel. She was the first of 6 children. She is smart as a whip. and her dad wanted her to go to college, and she did, but not right away. She married my dad when she was 18, and by the time she was 26, she had 4 children. When I was 26, after I graduated from law school, I went to her graduation. My mom has tenacity. When I think back on her life and moving from a small farm outside of Monroe City, Indiana, and ending up in the suburbs of St. Louis, I think about how difficult that had to be for her. But my mom is also fearless, and that's her legacy that she's left to me, tenacity and fearlessness. Finally, I want to talk to you about the legacy that Chief Justice Cady left. His legacy is wide and deep, and I can't begin to talk about all of it, but there's one comment that has really impressed itself upon me. Justice Mansfield wrote about Chief Justice Cady that no matter what your job or your position or how he came to meet you or whether you agreed with him, he looked directly into your eyes and saw great value in you. That's the legacy I want to adopt from Chief Justice Cady, finding value in each and every person and citizen that comes across my path. The legacy of the 3 important women in my life has established in me a foundation of dedication to the work before me, disciplined reflection and study, fearlessness and tenacity. To that, I take on as my foundation Chief Justice Cady's vision of great value and everyone around him. These I pledge as my foundation as a justice on the Iowa Supreme Court, and I respectfully request that you nominate me to the governor. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. And so we will begin with Mr. Spies.
Good morning, Mr. Real Schmidt.
Good morning.
On the issue of legacy, the Iowa Supreme Court has a history of pioneering in many areas of the law, including the areas of individual rights. And in addition to its adjudicative function, the Supreme Court also has broad administrative, supervisory, and attorney disciplinary functions as well. Are there any initiatives of the Supreme Court that you think should be pursued either in judicial education, attorney discipline, or community outreach that you think should be a top priority?
So I think a couple of things that should probably be a top priority is the continuation of the development of specialized courts. I think those have been a great asset to our judicial system. I know that personally I've talked to someone who told me that the drug court saved her daughter's life. And I also know that in reviewing Chief Justice Cady's State of the Judiciary, the juvenile court system, he made some references to that and some examples. So I think the development of those specialized courts, I think it's also been super helpful with respect to the business courts, having folks that understand business decisions. So I think that's an initiative that should continue. And I also think that working on access to justice and also that, and I know this is one of Commissioner O'Brien's pet areas, is staving off that pipeline of young men of color being a part of our justice system. There are a lot of things that can be done there, and I think there are a lot of things going on, but I do think that should be a priority as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bloom?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. So when we interviewed, we talked, as I think I talked to everybody about Article 1, Section 6 of the Iowa Constitution, and we had a discussion. We talked some about an analytical hierarchy and the approach a justice should approach making decisions with. And if I remember the case right, you referenced one from Judge Christensen. I think it was the Scoties-Brown decision, and her lawyers were advocating that the justice was related to a search and seizure issue or a legal stop issue, and they should look at the totality of circumstances, in this case, whether the officer was possibly biased. And so I can't remember how much we talked specifically about that, but so Justice Christensen, I think the way I interpreted her comments was she didn't see that as necessarily factual, sort of trying to get inside the mind of an officer at the time they're taking an action. But on the other hand, it dealt with a problem that is real, which is bias and how that affects how justice is delivered in our state. So I was thinking, well, maybe your administrative experience would help you see how you can influence and change culture, maybe outside the legal system. You want to have that impact. It may not always be a judge's decision. So could you talk a little bit about that, if that's a question? It's not a very good one.
So I think that within the confines of making judicial decisions, you have to follow some sort of analytical hierarchy. And that's what I call my way of approaching problems. And we've talked a little bit about that, and really a methodology that I would apply, and I really think is the methodology that one ought to apply in making judicial decisions. However, there are always opportunities to solve problems outside of judicial decision making, and that's part of really what the Iowa Supreme Court is charged with. They are charged with administrative duties and making the judicial system better. And so in that, I think in that particular instance, what you're saying is that here was a case where applying the law, we come up with an objective test for evaluating whether or not the officer should make a stop of someone in a vehicle. And that's what the judicial decision was. Are there ways to ensure that police officers are not making decisions based upon bias? Yes, and I think that might be carrying through some of the implicit bias training that Chief Justice Katie had marshaled. I know there's a lot of that in law enforcement right now, and I think that we could carry that probably even further into other areas, perhaps into the schools by administering implicit bias training for teachers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stanger.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Horbach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the news outlets presented all 12 applicants to the public, and they gave your name, your age, your city of residence, current position, where you got your law degree, and what year, and then a quote. And your quote is, "My appointment would encourage young women to be confident that their dedication," and that's the word I want you to remember, "that their dedication to their life's work, even as that work may change over time, will lay a solid foundation for their service." And you appropriately described your grandma's dedication. So those that you have inspired, how will they describe your dedication?
I think that they will describe it similar to how I describe my grandma's dedication, and it's dedication to the work that's before you today. It's not always, you don't always get to choose the work before you. It's wonderful when you get to, but dedication to whatever life brings you to work on, and being excited about it, regardless of whether you chose it or not. And I think that's what my grandma, how she embraced life, and she really did love to be busy, and she did love to do her work. And I think being dedicated to whatever you're charged with doing is the important thing.
Mr. Goodman.
I have no questions.
Mrs. Sinclair.
No questions.
Mr. Bevel.
Thank you. Today you talked about, you made reference to this prison pipeline and a lot of things going on to address that issue. Can you give us an example of one of those things that you've been impressed with?
So I think that there are a couple of different things that I think are working to help with that. And I don't know if this is one thing that we are doing, but something I heard just yesterday on the radio was in one area ensuring that there are fewer arrests of young men of color in their schools. So if you have a police officer in the school, really analyzing whether the situation should lead to arrest or there are other available options. If that's not something we are doing, it certainly is something that we ought to be doing and ensuring. I do think that the implicit bias training helps. It does help on the back end. not on the front end. So that helps as far as ensuring that the folks that are evaluating young men of color at least are cognizant of their own implicit bias. But I do think that there's a lot more to be done on the front end in sort of stopping that pipeline at the beginning rather than trying to patch it up at the end.
Thank you.
Ms. Law.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Gray.
I do not have any questions.
Ms. Pearson.
Thank you and good morning.
Good morning.
When we interviewed, we talked about your skills and strengths and talents that you would bring to the Supreme Court. And two areas that you mentioned one would be your analytical abilities as well as the ability to be objective in all situations. Tell us how those skills and talents would enhance the Supreme Court, please.
So I think any justice on the Supreme Court needs very deep analytical abilities and does need that measure of objectivity. Objectivity is important in a lawyer's life. I'm going to do a presentation in about 3 or 4 weeks. I need to get ready for it. I look at Commissioner Spies because he gave me some good fodder for material for that. But objectivity is really important in a lawyer's life in being able to really advise your clients so that they are taking the best route that they ought to take. And as far as the Supreme Court goes, obviously it's important to be objective, to not let your personal feelings weigh in the process, your whatever views you might have. Firstly, it's just important to come with a analytical methodology to apply, and I think that my ability to do that would certainly enhance the Iowa Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Ms. Conover.
No questions.
Mr. Berger.
No questions.
Ms. O'Brien.
No questions, thanks.
Mr. Sukup.
No questions.
Ms. Valentine.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
You have a little more of an unconventional path in your career than some of our other candidates. Could you share with us how you believe that would enhance your appointment to the Supreme Court?
So I think my unconventional path has given me a breadth and depth in a lot of areas that other folks haven't. It's taken me places that some folks haven't been. I've lived in very small towns, from Steamboat Rock, Iowa, about 300, I think, at the time when I lived there. But I grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis. I've lived in Des Moines. I've lived in Adel. I've lived in Pella. Boy, and I could go on, but I think that I have a breadth, and I've gotten to know folks from all walks of life. And what you really come to realize is that regardless of their political perspectives, their whether they are their, I think, economic situation, what type of work they do, their education, you come to realize that everyone's point of view is worthy of listening to and hearing about. So I think I bring that. I also think that I bring a breadth of experience in my professional life, as I've worked in small private practices. I worked for the government. I taught at Drake Law School for 10 years. So I think I bring a perspective that is very broad because of that path, and I'm thankful for it. I may not have always known what I was going to be doing next. That wasn't the way my life worked, but I always appreciated what I did next. It has been very valuable to me.
Thank you. Mr. Hoyntink, we have time for one quick question if you have one.
What do you think your greatest strength you would bring to the Supreme Court would be if appointed by the governor?
I think I'm a practical scholar. And so I think what you need on the Supreme Court is you do need scholars, people who can do the deep dive. They're wrestling with really difficult issues. But at the end of the day, you also have to be able to convey that in a way that folks can understand it. You have to not get lost in the nuances. And that's where the practical part of being a practical scholar comes from. And I think that being a practical scholar is an outgrowth of being strong in research, analysis, writing, and also perhaps a little bit of age.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for being here today. We wish you well.
Thank you so much.